Good afternoon, everybody. As explained, this is a little bit of a workshop come lecture to give you information on the second assignment, which, in my view, will help you along with the first assignment, bring a lot of the stuff that we've covered together in some pragmatic way by looking at an incident and seeing how all the various principles and elements and theory that we've covered over the last 5 weeks comes together. So the second assignment is going to ask you to look into the elements or the why behind the Chernobyl April 1986 nuclear accident. I call it the unimaginable catastrophe because I wrote a small brief paper about this, which I've included in my PowerPoint for you to read, and gives you a bit more insight into the incident further to what I'll be explaining here today. I think it's important before I start talking in detail about the incident is just to give a bit of background on nuclear reactors and their operations. All nuclear reactors, as we know, the current operating ones, are fission reactors. And fission is where a neutron comes along, hits predominantly what we call a uranium-235 atom. It's normally yellow cake, uranium fuel. That energy causes the nucleus of the uranium atom to split. This splitting of the atom creates an enormous amount of energy. If you remember from your physics, the equation E equals mc squared by Albert Einstein is how much energy you can calculate from the mass and the speed of light. And that energy is enormous. And not only does it produce energy, but it also produces a number of other atoms, fission products with a different nucleus, plutonium, xenon, and a whole bunch of other but that's not that important, because what you're doing is you're affecting the nucleus of the atom, and that's changing. Unlike a chemical reaction where you're only playing around with the electrons, here you're actually playing around with the nucleus itself and the protons and the neutrons. And then that just continues. You get more neutrons coming out. They find other uranium nuclei, that splits, and the chain reaction goes on and on and on. If you don't control that, you'll end up with an atomic explosion. But nuclear energy, the industry, harnesses this energy and can control the number of neutrons by absorbing them and controlling the reaction to generate enough heat for peaceful purposes, for generating energy. And that's basically the fundamental principle of a nuclear reaction. So, what's important as far as nuclear reactors are concerned, and I'm giving you this background, like I said, to when we start talking about the different controls, you get a better insight of what I'm talking about when I'm talking about control rods and cooling water and moderators and absorbers. The probability of nuclear fission reactions is measured by what we commonly is known as the neutron cross-section. It's used to express the likelihood or probability of a neutron colliding with a nucleus and in turn initiating a nuclear fission reaction. The units of this cross-section are 10 to the minus 28 square metres, so it's a very small area. This graph here illustrates the probability of a nuclear fission reaction in terms of the cross-section versus the energy of the neutrons. As you can see, the higher the speed of the neutrons, the lower the probability of actually initiating a fission reaction occurs. So in the case where you have, and it's mostly the case because uranium-235 is a very rare substance to find, even though South Australia is a big producer of uranium-235. You have low concentrations of this in what we call the enrichment fuel rods. And so that means the cross-sectional area is very small. So you need to slow down those neutrons to a level where they will initiate a nuclear reaction. So the higher the neutron energy over here, the lower the probability you're going to get a reaction. So there's a term in nuclear industry called moderate the speed. It's the moderator. It's, let's say, slowing down. It slows down these neutrons in the reactor to get to the right area within this cross-section to be able to initiate a reaction. And neutrons can be slowed down, if you think about it, because of their size, by other atoms which are of similar size. And in the case of moderators, fluid moderators used in nuclear reactors, they're either water because of the hydrogen, it's almost similar size, it collides, slows down, takes a bit of momentum away, slows it down, get it into the right zone, or graphite, carbon atoms. And this is very important as we start to talk through how this incident escalated. Now, excess neutrons, as I said, you just can't let the little blighters go loose because they'll find another atom and you'll get an out-of-control reaction. So what you need to do is to absorb those neutrons. And when we talk about control rods in a reactor, they're made from substances like boron and cadmium, which are good absorbers. Xenon isotope 135, which is a fission product in a nuclear reaction, is also an absorber. And you'll hear, or as I go through my presentation, I may mention the term the poisoning of the reactor core. Poisoning is when you produce xenon, absorbs a lot of the neutrons and the reaction dies, which you don't want to do. So it's a balancing act. So the excess neutrons must be absorbed and that you insert the control rods as you need to control the reactor by monitoring it. Note though that in some situations water can also be a neutron absorber. I say light water because light water is just normal water. Heavy water deuterium, which is also actually used as a moderator, but light water in particular can also absorb neutrons. And as I go through the events of the reactor, I will mention the case where the water did act as an absorber. All reactors, regardless of whether they're moderated by water or moderated by graphite, mind you, there's very few graphite moderated reactors, only those that are generating weapon grade plutonium are often graphite moderated, but that's irrelevant for the point here. Reactors are cooled by circulating water. So the water cools the reactor and extracts the heat, which then turns it into steam and then you spell the generators. Now reactors moderated and cooled by water are what we call inherently safer than those cooled by water but moderated by graphite, such as the RBMK reactor, which is the one that was at Chernobyl. The reason being is if you lose your water, say you lose your pumps, the reaction, there's nothing to moderate the neutrons, so they'll just shoot past the atoms and they won't be, the reaction will die. You'll get into this zone here. But with a graphite reactor, which is the Russian RBMK reactor, and which was one of the primary design faults of this reactor which led to this incident. If you take the cooling water, if you lose your circulation of your cooling water, the reaction will still continue because the graphite is still there to slow down the neutrons. So therefore you've got no cooling and your core overheats. It's a very basic, simple theory of how a nuclear reactor works. The RBMK reactor, which stands for these words in Russian, reactor, I'm not sure what the other words are. I can vaguely get them out because the Russian is very similar to the Greek letters, so because I know that's a reactor, and I'm not sure what the other words mean. This is a cross-section of the RBMK reactor, where this light grey represents the graphite. So the neutrons, once the reactor becomes critical and the neutrons start to be generated, these graphite surrounds these fuel rods. See, the fuel, the black are the control rods. They go in and out of the pressure channels, which are these shown here with, the pressure channels are these ones here, the red ones. And the yellow are the fuel rods. So what happens is the graphite surrounds these, and as the neutrons go through, they slow down, they react, hit the fuel rods, start creating nuclear reactions, start generating heat. The water is circulated from bottom up, turns into a steam turbine, runs the generators. The condensate from here goes back up into the system and back into the reactor, and the cycle continues. So that's a very basic cross-section of the reactor. And these black things are what we call the control rods. These were boron control rods, which would be inserted into the reactor as needed to stop and capture neutrons. And I'll talk more about that as I explain the design of the reactor and the things that started to go wrong. So that's just a basic overview of the reactor. When I put my lecture together, some of the key documents, I've had a lot of interest in the Chernobyl incident, because if you ever wanted to pick an incident, I call it the sort of the Michael Jordan of all incidents. From a consequence point of view, this is the one. A lot of the hows and whys are very similar to what we've already spoken about with lesser consequence incidents. But this one really captured my imagination from a long time ago, because I really wanted to know how something with such a large consequence could have been allowed to happen. NSAG, which is the International Nuclear Safety Advisory Group, produced 2 reports, and I'll talk a bit about that later. The first report was shortly after the incident. That was called NSAG 1. And then they produced their final report, NSAG 7. The link is there. You're welcome to read it if you ever have any interest, but I'm providing a lot of information summarised in this presentation. The sequence of events in a very summarised document are also provided there in a hyperlink. There was another report done by the United States Nuclear Regulatory Commission. I've got a hyperlink there as well. And this is my little summary paper, which you double click on that, it's PDF of what I call Chernobyl, the unimaginable catastrophe. Famous words by Anatoly Dyatlov, who was the Deputy Chief Engineer on the evening of that incident. And there's numerous other reference material on Canvas under the case study section on my Canvas site. These are other books that I've read cover to cover. So what I'm about to present to you is highly researched. It's not something I've imagined. I'm trying to present a real situation for you to be able to analyse and hopefully get some other. These are 3 excellent books on the Chernobyl incident. So what I want to talk about today, go back to our famous James Reason diagram. I want to talk to you about the what happened. I want to give you my interpretation of how things happened. And I'm going to leave to you to present to me, as part of your assignment, from all the information that I've provided, why it happened, using the process safety management elements, which as you're doing for the Piper Alpha assignment. So, you can't underestimate what happened. We all know. Reactor 4 obviously exploded. Release of massive radioactive material. This was not a nuclear explosion. This was actually a hydrogen explosion and a pressure explosion. The fact that they lost containment meant all the radioactive material in the reactor just spread out. Similar to what happened to Long Island, similar to what happened at Fukushima, but those, as you will see, were contained. Definitely the largest nuclear disaster in history. Over 4,000 related deaths. The evacuation of the Atomograd, as they called it, the satellite city of Pripyat, which was a town built specifically for this burgeoning nuclear power plant with 4 main reactors, and they were going to build another 3 on top of that in the Ukraine. And the radioactive cloud across Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, most of Europe was another huge consequence. And I know from relatives in Greece who there was evidence to suggest that certain yields of milk, cheese dropped, contamination levels picked up, so it did have quite a wide effect. So like I said, this was the Michael Jordan of all incidents. And something that we should not forget about. What I'm going to talk to you today about is how it happened. The overheating of the reactor core, caused by a phenomenon known as positive void coefficient of the reactivity, which I'll explain later, which is basically what I said earlier, really, when you lose your when you lose the water, whatever's left turns into steam. That steam loses the heat transfer capability of the reactor. The reactor overheats. An inherent design flaw, which is fundamental to this nuclear reactor. I want to also explain to you the why it happened, understanding why and where. Well, I won't be explaining the why, you'll be explaining the why, but where the focus will come, and I'll be explaining the how, what all these different controls, which failed, how they failed. You'll analyse, understanding why these failed through the information that I'm going to present, which you will then be able to distill into the process safety element discussion. And obviously the what happened was an explosion and the eventual radioactive emissions. What I want to do now is I want to give you present to you a 12-minute video animation of the nuclear incident, which will illustrate in a very sophisticated way the things that I'm going to talk about.
Nuclear power had become routine, and a bright atomic future lay ahead. The Soviet Union had 5 of these huge power stations, But there is only one of these we all know about: Chernobyl. On this evening, there was no hint of the catastrophe about to unfold that would have a profound impact on the USSR and nuclear power around the world. At 1:23 a.m. during a safety test, the AZ-5 button was pushed. About 8 seconds later, reactor 4 exploded. Why did the emergency shutdown blow up the reactor? This is the central Chernobyl question. At the time of the disaster, Ukraine was one of the 15 Soviet republics. Chernobyl was in northern Ukraine, near the Belarus border. The centerpiece of these power stations was the RBMK reactor. The RBMK was a graphite reactor which had been powering Soviet growth since 1970. Chernobyl's reactor number 4 was only 2.5 years old. These are the main systems of the RBMK design. The nuclear reactor produces large quantities of heat. To collect this heat, pumps circulate water in pipes vertically up through the reactor. Steam is collected in separator drums. The steam spins the turbine generators which power the electrical grid. The steam is cooled back into water from a large lake and fed back into the main circuit, and the cycle repeats. It runs like this at full power for months on end. The buildings required to accommodate the systems were extensive. The components were located inside individual concrete compartments. The concrete vault around the reactor was 2.5 meters thick. The reactor was housed inside a steel drum. A central component of this story is graphite. Chernobyl's RBMK core contained huge amounts of it, which was essential for the nuclear reaction. When an atom splits, it releases neutrons at near the speed of light. These neutrons go too fast to split the surrounding uranium. Neutrons slow down as they bounce around inside the graphite until they travel slowly enough to split more atoms. The graphite is called the moderator because it moderates the neutron speed. Each graphite block has a hole down the center, which contains the pipes for the fuel channels and control rods. Water flows inside these pipes at high pressure. The uranium fuel is formed into these small pellets. Each pellet is extremely fuel dense and contains the heat energy equal to a truckload of coal. A reactor must have an on-off switch and a way to set the power level. This is done with control rods. These are made of boron, which is a very powerful neutron absorber. When the rods are in the core, they kill the reaction. With about 80% of the rods withdrawn from the core, the reactor runs at full speed. When the control rods were extracted, they left a space behind. The lower half of the control rods were made of graphite, which filled this void. Substituting boron with graphite was a sound design principle. The reactor was more efficient, and it made the control rods twice as effective. The explosion was the result of a design error called the tip effect. This caused a momentary power spike precisely when the control rods were supposed to kill reactivity. The graphite displacers did not extend all the way to the floor of the reactor. The lowest 1.25 meters were cut short to equalize fuel burn. The base of the reactor was where things went badly wrong, but we will come back to this. The objective of the test was to simulate loss of grid power and verify if the flywheel effect of the turbines could power the water pumps until the diesel generators powered up. 3 previous attempts at this test had failed. The test had to be performed during a reactor shutdown, but on this day, the shutdown was paused at 50% power for most of the day. This resulted in 2 crucial contributors to the disaster. 1, the reactor became neutron poisoned, and 2, the test was performed by the less experienced night shift, who had not been properly briefed. At 1 a.m. the shutdown began, but was paused because the electrical grid needed additional power, and Chernobyl Unit 4 had to make up the shortfall. After a 19-hour pause, the shutdown was permitted to continue. The new shift took over at midnight and put the reactor onto auto control to keep it steady at 22% power. Except auto mode was not designed for a poisoned core. Power plummeted to 1% before the test had been done. While the reactor was running at half power, it became poisoned with xenon gas, which is a powerful neutron poison. A basic reactor rule is to never restart a reactor which has been poisoned because it is unstable. Xenon forms 6 hours later and interferes with the fine equilibrium of the nuclear reaction. The engineer in charge, Anatoly Dyatlov, was under pressure to do the test. He made the fateful decision to extract almost every control rod to bring the reactor back up to enough power for the test. This was like in a car applying more than full throttle to counter a jammed handbrake. 1 hour after the reactor stalled, the controllers had raised the power back up to 6%. The test was performed at 1:23 a.m. and lasted 40 seconds. The control staff had agreed beforehand, upon completion of the test, the AZ5 button was to be pushed to complete the shutdown. The control staff reported all was calm at this time. You may be familiar with the flip cover and rotating switch, but this was the retrofit after the disaster. The button Leonid Toptanov famously pushed was most likely this one. The control rods were in this configuration when the AZ5 was pushed. It is frightening that there was just one rod fully inserted. At no time should the core have had less than the equivalent of 26 rods active, but on this evening it had almost none, because of the misguided attempt to counterbalance the xenon poison. The reactor had been pushed too far. The AZ5 inserted all the control rods simultaneously. Reactor 4 was teetering on the brink, and the tip effect would be the final straw. Water is a weak neutron poison. As the graphite displaced the water, a temporary power surge formed across the floor of the reactor. The boron would arrive too late. The rapid jump in power caused steam bubbles. Less water meant less neutron poison, more heat, and more reaction. This was the feedback loop to destruction. There was now nothing stopping a reactivity runaway. The base of the reactor was overwhelmed, and fuel channels vaporized. Reactor pressure was lost, and coolant water flashed to steam, increasing reactivity across the core. Reactor 4, in that instant, was producing the energy equivalent to much of the Soviet electric grid. Reactor power surged to an estimated 20 times the maximum. We will never know, because there was nothing left to do the measuring. The reactor drum and the building structure could not hold all that sudden energy release. The explosion blew the 2,000-ton reactor lid through the roof, and it landed back in the reactor pit on its side. The north face of the building fell away in the explosion and exposed the steam tanks and main pumps. Firemen spoke of warming their hands over the graphite which was lying all around on the ground. They were unaware they were exposing themselves to lethal doses of radiation. This was a heat and gas explosion. It was not an atomic bomb, and nuclear scientists get frustrated when Chernobyl is called one. This is the control room about 25 years later. Its equipment had been reused elsewhere, while the remainder was scavenged by souvenir hunters and radiation stalkers. Soviet nuclear scientists were aware of the tip effect problem. There had been previous channel ruptures from the AZ5 tip effect in Leningrad 1975 and Ignalina 1983. Design changes had been recommended. The RBMK was considered very robust, and it was widely believed that an RBMK could not explode. No changes were made, and crucially the lurking danger was kept secret from operators. Had they known, they could have compensated for it in their decision-making. The controllers took comfort in the AZ-5 emergency shutdown button always being there if they needed to shut down the reactor in a hurry. But it turned out to be the hidden detonator in the wrong configuration. The IAEA Commission states that at below 50% power, the control instruments provided incomplete feedback. The low power dangers were not well described in the operating documentation, and the procedures were sometimes contradictory. The operators would have been somewhat blind to what was going on inside the reactor, and had to rely more on experience and intuition for control. To build inherently safer reactors, later designs, including those in Russia, utilized water as the moderator. Water is a far superior moderator. It added a vital additional automatic reactivity control, and the core could be way smaller. As the water boils into steam, the moderator disappears, and there is an instantaneous drop in reactivity. With higher grade uranium, water can be used as the moderator. Graphite was a favored moderator in earlier reactors around the world for low-grade uranium. The switch to water happened when uranium enrichment technology had advanced to the point where the large quantities required could be produced. With perfect hindsight, it is so easy to be critical of a time when the science was in earlier stages and there was minimal computer modeling. Man can dream up the most amazing things, but ultimately it is humans who are responsible for the things going wrong. We will never really know what happened in the control room that night, and tragically, most who were there paid with their lives, as they heroically scrambled to deal with multiple other dangers that could have put the other reactors at risk of meltdown and a wider disaster. It's natural to focus on the recklessness of a few, but this is as much a story about the epic bravery and personal sacrifice of so many. Occasionally humans fail, but mostly we succeed. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this, please add a like and subscribe to my...
It's probably one of the best videos I've seen on a incident, and the graphics are pretty phenomenal, as you could see. Now I'm going to continue talking about this incident and probably repeating in more detail some of the points that were raised in that video. You would hear a number of names. If anyone ever saw the HBO nuclear Chernobyl miniseries, Valery Legasov was one of the chief investigators, and I'll be talking about him later as where he fitted in the nuclear industry in the USSR. Online there are many tapes, a number of tapes of Legasov, who prior to his death, his sudden death, he tape recorded his findings towards the end, and it's a very interesting insight into the incident, and I've listened to all 4 tapes. Obviously they've been translated into English, but an extremely insightful account of what happened as far as his findings were concerned. Anatoly Dyatlov, I think, was unfairly portrayed in the HBO series. As you would see in the discussion paper, in my little paper about the unimaginable catastrophe, words that I took from the real interview by the real Anatoly Dyatlov. He was a deputy chief engineer, and he was an extremely competent nuclear reactor expert. I felt him and others, Fomin and Brekhanov, were, during the inquiry, were just simply made scapegoats for failures, organisational and institutional failures in the USSR, as I'll explain. So, if we're going to answer the why question, you have to understand what controls are in place and then analyse a bit why they failed. I've utilised the bow tie methodology to try and illustrate this. As you see here, the threat line starts with the overheating of the reactor, what we call a positive void coefficient of reactivity, which is caused by losing your cooling medium or your cooling medium turning to steam, creating a void, which then loses the heat transfer capacity of that fluid around the core, causing the core to overheat, which was the case with the inherent design of RBMK reactors. Before you could get to the situation of the explosion, which was well illustrated by the animation in the previous video, there are a number of controls that you have in place. The first and most fundamental control is your cooling system, your water system. And using bow tie methodology, you ask yourself the question, what can go wrong to my water cooling system? And the sub-threat line to that would be, I lose my power, or there's a disruption of power to my pumps. So what controls do I have in place? Or are in place, or what controls were in place are in place for RBMK reactors? Mind you, there's still a few of them operating in Russia. They're about to be decommissioned in the coming years. And that's not to say there was something like 20 odd these type of reactors. So circumstances led to an incident occurring, and it could have been prevented, as we'll talk later. But nevertheless, they still can be run safely, and they've done some modifications to the design, but nevertheless, the cooling water system is your fundamental first physical barrier of protection to prevent overheating. If you lose your power, there's reactor power control systems. These, I'm not going to go into detail how they work, but there's local control and physical control. Control within and detectors located inside the core, used to control the reactor at high power, and these will allow rods to come in and out depending on the power. There's what we call what they call local automatic control and local automatic protection systems. They're detectors inside and outside the core, again used to control the reactor at low power. So these were all systems that were properly thought of, properly designed for the particular threats that could face these reactors. There were also other preventative controls for power reduction through increased speed at different levels. Again, it's dealing with the power by having what they call AZ1, AZ2 and AZ3 event regimes, which allowed the reactor to compensate for power loss through adjusting its speed. Again, automatic controls. And the final control, if these were to fail, was the backup diesel generators. Ironically, the whole initiating event which led to this incident was a critical function test of these very backup diesel generators. These generators, which I'll explain later, maybe further in my presentation, work on diesel. But when you have a total loss of power, it takes about 30 seconds for your diesel generators to kick in. So the critical function test was, with losing power, as your turbines wind down, using that power or that momentum or that flywheel effect to keep your pumps running while your backup diesel generators kick in. But this system had never been tested, even after the design, even against Russia's own nuclear regulations. Before you commission a reactor, you've got to test you've got to do critical function tests on all your critical controls, and this was one of them. So they started the reactor, they were producing power for a number of years, but they still had to tick the box that this backup generator or backup power through the winding down of the turbines still works. And this was the test they were trying to do on that fateful an evening. The other protection, if the cooling water system started to fail, there were steam drum trip switches. If the steam got too much, meant there was too much heat, and those switches would actually trip the reactor. They were bridged on that evening. They were overridden for whatever reason to do with the test, but this again goes back to the how these things. So this particular control was actually deactivated. The other control, if that fails and your reactor starts to get overheat, there was emergency core cooling system. Every reactor in the nuclear industry has emergency core cooling system. It floods the reactor with vast amount of water to allow the reactor to cool suddenly. Those pumps were isolated on that evening of that test again. And the final thing, when all things start to go wrong, you press what they call the AZ5 button, or the scram button, the emergency shutdown, where all the rods go in and shut the reactor. And as was shown in that animation, there were problems with the design which led to the overheating and the runaway reaction, which we'll talk about also. So you've had 4 physical layers of protection to prevent this happening. Let's move on. The steam drum, again, I talked about that, but it's here in the slide. Trip switch failure, or is it bridged with critical function testing? That's why you do the critical function testing of these things. Shutting down a reactor every so often, you've got to test that these things are working. Similar to what happened in Texas City incident, where none of these controls were being tested. If you're going to change that, then your last layer is you need a permit to work or a management of change procedure. There was no evidence of that. So I'm giving you some snippets of some of the whys, which I hope you'll closely review the video and it will help you with your assignment. The emergency cooling system, again, pump failure or locked out. In this case here, they were actually locked out. They were locked out because they didn't want that to... They were undertaking this test during a shutdown of the reactor to test the rundown test of the turbines. For some reason, they thought it was important to lock out the pumps in case they were activated when too much steam was being generated. Who knows? Again, pretty uncertain, but nevertheless, a reflection of some interesting decision making. Again, insufficient power to operate safely the pumps. These were controlled by what they call Category 1 and Category 2 backup power system requirements, which again were on the emergency control. This was an emergency cooling system, not on the cooling water system itself. This was to drop the water to be out. So if they lost power, they had plenty of backup power to activate these emergency cooling systems. Again, but these would have been subject to obviously critical function testing. And finally, of course, was the final shutdown button. Reactivity surge due to graphite tips, design standards. That's a threat. The problem with the emergency button, as I will explain, and as was explained in the video, the tips, the way that graphite tips were designed, they were too short. When they were lifted, when the rods were lifted out of the reactor to keep the reactions going, water made its way underneath into the pressure tubes. That acted as a moderator, as an absorber, which slowed the reaction down. As soon as they pressed the AZ button, as the control rods were being inserted, they pushed out the water, which is acting as an absorber, creating a sudden surge of reactivity, which then created a high amount of steam generation, positive void coefficient occurring, overheating, and then the incident. Insufficient rate of neutron absorption, rod insertion speed. This is another issue which I will talk about. The rods, when they were inserting far too slow. let alone they had taken out too many rods to begin with, so that wouldn't have made much of a difference. So here I'm illustrating how you can use a bow tie to dissect a threat and an incident to get to understanding the controls, how things could go wrong, and then focus on why could these things go wrong and what are the elements or the process safety elements that could lead to these controls being compromised. That is the key purpose of, number one, this presentation to you, and number two, the assignment that I've set for you. The beauty about bow tie analysis, you can dissect threat lines to what and top events to whatever level you want to do the analysis. In this case here, I've turned the positive void coefficient, or overheating, into the top event. What I've said, the threat, I've gone to the power supply disruption. So rather than treating the power supply reduction as an escalating factor, I'm actually treating it as its own threat line to be able to use the software to go into a deeper analysis of what went wrong. So my threat line is the power supply to the cooling water pumps, and the top event is the reactor overheating. So the consequence is the explosion, which in the previous diagram was the top event. The consequences were obviously the radioactive and releases and all the other terrible things that followed. So if I then dig deeper for the power supply disruption, I look at reactor power control systems. That will help. Go back up to the top one. The control for that power disruption is obviously the power control systems that are in place, the preventative control for the power reduction, and the backup diesel generators, which I spoke about in the previous slide as well. Now I'm going to look into what could possibly have gone wrong with the reactor power control system. One thing that wasn't mentioned in that video, was mentioned, but I don't think it was not accurate based on the findings of the NSAG findings, the safe power levels were not set, which is a critical operating procedure. When they started to do the test, and again I'll analyse this further in my dot points, which will proceed here, one of the operators forgot to set the low power level switch. In other words, a switch which would not have allowed the reactor to drop below the 300 megawatt thermal power range. Because he forgot to press that, the reactor automatically went down to zero, or was heading towards zero power, which caused the xenon poisoning. Because there was, the reactor was losing power, xenon was being generated, and it was just poisoning the reactor. Threat line, again, going deeper again, looking at the critical operating procedure, the reactor control failure, the SCADA system. This is the threat line, the safe power level not being set correctly as my threat line. Obviously now my top event is the power drops below the safe level. You can see how you can cascade this in your analysis, because this is obviously the threat, safe power level not set correctly. Now I'm looking at what could escalate to a critical operating procedure not being followed properly. The reactor controls failure, SCADA system, display of operating reactivity margin. What that means, it's like a control, like a measuring the speed on a dashboard. It is telling you how much safety margin you have, or how many, it represents how many control rods you have in your reactor and how safely your reactor is actually performing. The SCADA system and the display to that SCADA system was found not to actually be even in the control room. It was actually outside of the control room. So these guys, when they were doing the test or getting ready for the test, they were running blind. The other control, of course, is the automatic instrumentation of the insertion removal of control rods. That was switched off because they wanted to manually. The final thing is to manually insert the rods, but if you've actually taken too many rods off, you're creating an unstable reactor, you lose control there as well. So going back to the power supply disruption to the pumps, failure of power to reach a safe level in terms of this particular control. Again, these were isolated, and the only way in a normal operating reactor to ensure these are working is critical function testing and maintaining this particular control. And the final one is your backup diesel generator, which, as I said earlier, if these fail to activate in sufficient time, then you've got a bit of a problem, and that's what they were doing. They were actually doing the critical function test on these backup diesel generators at the time of the incident. So, if we get to overheating, then the threat line here is the power supply to the coolant water pumps, but the top event is the reactor overheating. The consequence is the core, obviously, explosion, which is not the consequence in terms of effects on the environment or the loss of containment, but this is simply the explosion incident. The steam drum trip switches, if the trip switch failure or bridged, that control was non-existent. The emergency water cooling system, as I explained earlier, this is again a way of representing on a bow tie, looking at the prevention of an explosion. These pumps were actually locked out. And finally, the AZ butt, which I spoke about earlier. Before I get into the actual explanation of the various facts, even further to this presentation on the PowerPoint, on the bow tie, a key thing of most nuclear reactors worldwide, it's not a key thing, it's a mandated requirement. The reactors have to be in a purposely built, designed containment building that can withstand a full rupture, a full explosion of the reactor. The building that was shown in that video was not a containment building. It was just a factory building. It was not designed for the containment. Those nuclear reactors that got these containment buildings, a jumbo jet can hit them and they will still stand upright. They are designed with 2.5 metres of concrete right round. The reactor's in there, it's isolated. This reactor had no containment building, and I'll explain in a moment. I'll give you the facts to help you in your study. And these are things that you do. You've obviously got a structural integrity, so you've got to inspect and maintain. But if you've got no building, there's nothing to inspect or maintain. This is a typical reactor. This is your last barrier of protection in any nuclear. The 4 Mile incident in the US, the incident in Fukushima, they all had these containment buildings. They had loss of containment, but they were contained within. The reactor failed, released, but it was contained in these buildings. So we didn't have the consequences that Chernobyl had. So, what am I going to go through today? I'm going to now present some of the facts on how the things happened and touch on some of the why, but I want you to elaborate on them as you work through your assignment. That's the aim of your assignment. So, I'm just going to provide relevant background and facts which you'll be able to use in undertaking your assignment. Let's start off with, on the 26th of April, emergency power test on the turbine rundown unit test was being undertaken. In principle, the whole purpose of this test involved the following steps during a planned shutdown. As I explained in previous lectures, when you're doing critical function testing on critical safety equipment like switches and trip switches and power generation for emergency backup power, You don't do that when you're in full operation. You do that while you're shutting a plant down, because that's the safest time, because if anything goes wrong, the plant is shutting down. What you'll find here, what unfolded was the nuclear plant here was the reactor was shutting down, but then they tried to relife it again because they felt pressure of having to do this test. So the object of this test was to cut the steam supply from the reactor to the turbines. And that began for the turbines then to start to spin down because they had no more steam, and they were still generating electricity. Send a signal to reactor safety systems that external power was lost. That would in turn trigger their emergency diesel generator, which will connect the rundown of steam turbine to circulation pumps until the diesel generator kicked in. And once the results of the test were recorded, the operators would trip the AZ5 system by pressing that button for a full emergency stop. Very simple test, nothing complicated. Everything was meant to be safe. We were shutting down. We just wanted to measure how much power this running spinning turbine was generating. Was it enough to run the backup diesel generators or circulate the pumps while the backup diesel generators were starting, because they needed about 30 seconds, 40 seconds to start. So the answer is, well, what could possibly go wrong and why? Some relevant background about the institutional and the political and policy factors. This hits at the heart of the institutional organisational stuff, right at the left-hand side of James Reason's model. Russia, post-war, had massive industrialisation ambitions. It had a growing energy demand, and electrification in the USSR was absolutely essential. The fossil fuel deposits in Siberia were too expensive to bring to the European part of the USSR via pipelines or power lines at the time. Hydropower in the European part of the USSR was not practical due to they would have had to flood vast areas of riverbed terrains and move towns. This is the thinking behind that institutional thinking, vision. And the Cold War was on. So they needed to maintain nuclear weapons. That program was important to them. So what's he talking about? What's this got to do with the nuclear reactor? When I said from the start, organisational, institutional factors are fundamental to understand when you're doing process safety, as we saw with the Texas City incident, as you will see with the Piper Alpha. This is where the boiling frogs are, and that's what ends up in creating conditions for individuals to make errors or actions or inactions that will lead to a result or to an incident. The Central Planning Commission, known as GOSPLAN, was the commission that was responsible for expediting the electrification vision of Russia and seeking the quickest, most cost-effective solution. The Ministry of Media and Machine Building, SREDMASH, which was in charge of the nuclear weapons, and they designed, built and commissioned nuclear reactors in close collaboration with what was known as the Khrushchev Institute of Atomic Energy, which was responsible for development of nuclear science technology across the USSR, headed up by Anatoly Alexandrov, but more importantly, Legasov. If you ever watched the HBO series, that's where Legasov lived. He was the deputy director of this institute. NIKET was the Soviet Reactor Design and Nuclear Safety Agency. They were the agency that was responsible for ensuring safety of nuclear reactors. You'll see the importance as I talk by. The Ministry of Energy, Minergo, they operated the reactors, but they lacked the same expertise as the SREDMASH ministry. They didn't design, they didn't build, they didn't commission. Their job was then to operate them. So you had one institution, touching here on some key things that will help your essay. An institution that designed, built, hand-passed over to another institution that operated them. And the former SREDMASH was the sexy organisation. That was the organisation where all the big nuclear guys wanted to work. No one wanted to work in the operating bit. Leave that just to operators. More on that in a moment. Now let's start looking at some of these organisational factors. These are facts. These are facts which I'm providing you from all the stuff I've read, because for you to read and get to this level it would be impossible for such an assignment, but I'm looking at you thinking in that process safety framework and putting this all together to explain how you see all this led up to this unfortunate incident. Water-moderated reactors, known as the VVER reactors in Russia, were around. They were called American reactors because they used water as the moderator. Were compared to the graphite moderator reactor. Why was then the RBMK reactor, which was less inherently safe, chosen? Why was it less inherently safe? As I explained, it was vulnerable to the phenomena of positive void coefficient of reactivity. That is, because the graphite moderated and the cooling water cooled, and they weren't the same, they didn't perform the same function. If you lost your water, the reactor kept on creating, the water would turn into steam, the steam would reduce the efficiency of the cooling of the reactor core, and hence the reactivity would just continue to happen and increase and increase. The other important thing, Russia wanted to use as little as possible uranium. So their choice was the use of low-level enriched nuclear fuel. Water cannot moderate enough neutrons because of the density of, think about all these uranium atoms. The less of them you've got, the slower the more neutrons you have to slow down to hit. Water's not dense enough. Whereas graphite, with carbon atoms in an atom, they can moderate more. So that was one of the reasons they also chose it. And it was lower cost because they didn't need to use as high enriched uranium. The other issue, which I'll talk in a moment about the control rod design, was tips were too short, and we'll talk about that in a moment. So the cost came quite clear, not only because of the saving in cost because you're using less enriched nuclear fuel. You can make these reactors could be made in existing factories. They were modular in construction because they were just hundreds of graphite blocks stacked onto each other with the tubes and the pressure tubes in the middle. And the biggest issue, which I touched on earlier, I explained earlier, they dispensed with the containment building due to the size of the reactor building. They decided that they would not build a containment building because they had this preconception that these reactors would not explode. And that led to a halving of a major cost. Just a bit more on the physics. What we have here is the dark grey is what we call is the graphite. This here is the fuel part of the reactor. Just think of these here as the fuel rods containing the uranium. These are the absorbers. So when I want to shut down the reactor, I push these rods into this place. The boron is in place where the reactor is, and it absorbs the neutrons and the reactor shuts down. Normal operation was to lift the rods up. The graphite will come into play, good design feature, come into line with the reactor cores. It would moderate the neutrons and hence accelerate the reactivity, and you have a reaction happening. As you pull these, by pushing the rod back, and the reactivity increases. So as you're pulling this up, by pushing the rod back, you're pushing the rod, normal operation is down here where the graphite is. As you're pushing that down, that will shut it in. As you're pulling this up, what happens is your absorber, your graphite rods come right out. These part of the reactor chambers fill with water. That water acts as an absorber, which means your reactor also starts to slow down, which is great. But the problem is that if you're too far out, as you push this in, this is what they call, referred to as the tip effect. That tip pushes out the water and it creates a power surge, because this is where the rods were expected to be normally kept when you're wanting to lift the rods up to a certain level. So that's basically how the neutron absorber works. This is the operating shutdown position, because you've got the absorber in. When you get to this point, you're operating. This was the highest level that these rods should have been, but in the case of the Chernobyl incident, they had pulled the rods too far out, allowed too much absorption, and when they pushed that rod in, it created a power surge, and these things were going in far too slow, but I'll explain that a bit further as we go. I want to talk now about some systemic factors. In December 1973, as was also mentioned in the video, the first RMBK reactors started at Leningrad Power Station. The construction of those reactors commenced at Chernobyl and also at Kursk, two major areas within the Ukraine. Now, the Leningrad reactor had not even reached full power, and the problems began to become clear. The positive void coefficient effects, the inherent design feature, grew worse as more fuel was being consumed. They were seeing that positive void because of the fact it was graphite moderated. The longer in operation, the reactors became harder to control. By the time they reached the 3-year operational shutdown for maintenance, the reactors were almost unpredictable. The designers, which were part of the Kirchhoff Institute and the Nuclear Safety Agency, made modifications, but instability still remained and did not seek to explore the problems further. So they were having plenty of warnings that these reactors were starting to get unstable, particularly towards the as they approach their maintenance shutdown time requirements. No reference to the positive void coefficient with the RBMK reactors was made in any of the operating manuals accompanying each reactor. So a lot of the people like the Anatoly Dyatlov, who were very experienced nuclear engineers, weren't aware of the positive void coefficient at all. Another inherent design issue with the reactor was the excessive size of the core, very large core. It led to uneven reactivity within the core, resulting in isolated hotspots of reactivity in the core, which were difficult to measure, difficult to detect. The problem was pronounced during startup and shutdown operations when reactors were operating, became more evident when they were shutting down and starting up and shutting down. The systems designed to monitor the reactivity within the reactor core proved unreliable at low power. During such periods, operators and engineers in control room became blinded to what was happening in the reactor core zone. Instead of reading instruments, they were forced to estimate reactivity levels in the core by experience and intuition. Charming. This made startups and shutdowns high-risk operations, startups and shutdowns, because of this instability. In November 1975 in Leningrad, there was a reactivity surge incident. During startup of Unit 1, the power plant of Leningrad, power plant after scheduled maintenance, the AZ5 button was activated. The reactor began to run out of control. But before the chain reaction could be stopped, a partial meltdown occurred, destroying and damaging 32 fuel assemblies and releasing radiation into the atmosphere over the Gulf of Finland. They had a miniature Chernobyl. First major accident involving RBMK reactor 1 year after reaching full power output. The ministry set up a commission to investigate this. The official line of findings was that a manufacturing defect led to the destruction of a single fuel channel rod. The commission knew otherwise. The accident was a result of inherent dissolved faults in the reactor, and the positive void coefficient was a key contributor. But they refused to announce that or make that clear to the current operating. They suppressed the commission findings and covered up the accident, and operators of other RBMK reactors were never informed of the power surge issues with the tip effects. In 1976, the Commission released its recommendations from this investigation to reduce positive void coefficient through reducing graphite in the core by increasing fuel enrichment. Less graphite in your fuel, you can start using more water cooling and using more higher enriched fuel. Introducing additional absorber rods, redesigning the absorber rods to improve neutron flux distribution across the core, and also during rod withdrawal, and creating a faster emergency shutdown system. In other words, when they press the button, these rods can go into place faster and quicker. In 1976, the Commission recommendations, designers from the Kirchhoff Institute and Niket Agency again failed to address these recommendations. They refused to address them. Moscow promptly ordered more RBMK reactors to be built, day after Leningrad meltdown. So there was indications there, but no one seemed to be reacting. The vision was, we need more nuclear energy, we need to speed up our electrification policy. And the Ministry of Energy that operated these reactors found not to have had access, so the Monegro who operated these did not have access even to the investigation report or its recommendations. In 1977, August, Chernobyl reactor number 1 went critical. It was commissioned. Operators soon discovered that the reactor was difficult to control. Inherent instabilities proved mentally and physically demanding on operators and control engineers. Dozens of control adjustments were being required every minute. The engineers, when commissioning the reactor, had to double up the control panel to cope with complexity of the task. Some of these panels worked so hard that the control rods quickly, the switches quickly wore out and had to be replaced constantly. You'd think that would have been an indicator that something's not quite right. And then after the first 3-year planned shutdown of the first reactor, they found the water steam coolant pipes were badly corroded in zirconium steel, which the fuel rods are contained in. The joints were very loose and lacked necessary integrity. So, in 1980, a confidential study into the design was undertaken. It listed major design failings and thermohydraulic instabilities, which undermine the safety of the reactor, including threat of positive void coefficient. Made it clear accidents were likely in the course of everyday operations. No action taken to redesign the reactor to correct these failings or warn plant personnel of them. No engineering of new safety systems to address these were taken into account. Simply, the nuclear regulator, nuclear energy, simply revised operating instructions to address these hazards, but did not emphasise limit or operational reactivity margin, which is a measure of the minimum number of control rods required to control the positive void coefficient threat, and how crucial it was to prevent major accident. They assumed operators will follow without fail the new instructions. Updated instructions received by NEC were neither explicit or explained. So rather than going through the design and improving the safety of these reactors, they simply prepared an operating procedure and assumed that the nuclear operators would simply follow these. No training, no simulation training on emergency, no checks that people understood those operating procedures and the consequence if they weren't following. None of that was done. 1983, when they were commissioning number Unit 4, the one that blew up in 86, in 83, they observed the reactivity surge when control rods lowered in the core. So they saw the same issue, but at a lower level. The inspector acknowledged this fact, but still approved the reactor for full operation during commissioning. So when they were commissioning, they noticed a power surge as they were inserting the rods. The designers updated the operator's manual to specify a minimum number of control rods at all times to be no less than 30 out of the total 211 needed to remain in the reactor. Note, at the time of the incident, there were only 8 control rods in the reactor. They'd all been lifted above their safety level. There was no technical change made to the reactor example interlock to prevent all rods being removed. So the proof of the 1980 confidential study findings and repeat of the same corrective actions were observed in 1983. So the operational issues. When they were doing the rundown test on the 26th of April, the critical safety test mechanism to use the momentum, 30 to 180 seconds during the total loss of power of the plant while emergency diesel generators were started. Test was not performed. This is important because these were operational issues. So when you're looking at analysing against the elements, you may want to take these into consideration. This test was never performed before the plant was commissioned, even though this was protocol, this critical function test. It was delayed for 2 years after the commissioning as part of scheduled maintenance shutdown, and this is basically where they were looking at doing the test. The shutdown of Unit 4 reactor and the rundown test was scheduled for 2 p.m. in the afternoon of Friday the 25th of April, not the morning of the 26th of April in the early hours. Nikolai Fomin, who was the plant chief engineer, ordered the test approval without getting approval of the State Committee for Nuclear Safety or specialists at the Khrushchev Institute, nor the director of Chernobyl, who was Viktor Burkhanov. They had no idea of this test. So he broke all the protocols of why this test needed to be undertaken. The couple of other things happened which led to the delays. The electrical grid intervened in Kiev during the day, delaying the shutdown to 9 p.m. due to peak load demand. Rather than abandoning the test for another day, they just simply delayed it, pushed it down the time. By the time the test commenced, which was after midnight, many of the engineers who were briefed on this test, who actually were going to be involved in this test, they left the shift, they left work, thinking, well, the test will be cancelled, and the shift changed. The safe power level was meant to be no less than 700 megawatts after commencement of the test without any change authorisation. Dyatlov changed it to 200 megawatts. No one knows why, but he changed it to 200, thinking that it would still be safe. Even in his interviews, he said that was not the cause of the incident. I didn't need to keep it at 700, I could have gone to 200. Before the test commenced, the local automatic computer controlled power level, which I explained earlier, was not set. This is a form of autopilot that would keep the reactor at a steady power level while they're doing the test. As a result of not setting this local automatic control, the computer defaulted to the last set point, which was 0. And that's why the reactor started to go down. The emergency cooling water pumps were locked out, the steam drum switches were bridged, and xenon poisoning was naturally shutting the reactor down as they were doing the test. Protocol was, if you get a poisoned reactor, you abort the test as per safety procedures. Abort the test, go home, and come back the next day. The reactor will be totally safe because there's no reactivity. When the power continued to drop, all the control rods, bar 8 of them, were removed to increase the power, and this was directed by Dyatlov. The automatic system controlling the insertion and withdrawal of the control rods, which would have prevented this happening, was switched off, and the rods were then controlled manually. Mind you, the reactor was being shut down, so normally it would have just shut down, they would have done the test, and it would have been quite safe. But because of the poisoning and it went below the level that they could actually do the test, they wanted to increase the power back up. And that's why Dyatlov instructed they start to remove as many rods as possible to overcome the xenon poisoning. Training is an important issue. It's well renowned that the industry, nuclear industry being a new industry, and something else Russia was poorly resourced. There was no accident simulator training, which is a must in the nuclear industry, just like the airline industry. It's a must to have that sort of training for emergencies. That's what you have aeroplane simulators, because you don't want to put an aeroplane in the air and switch off all the engines and see whether you can save you, so you do it by simulation. The same with nuclear reactors. Reliance, and this was quite heavily referenced in a lot of the reports, reliance on operating these reactors was given to professional judgment. Terms like experience and intuition, encouraging improvisation while operating a nuclear reactor. Lack of understanding of the positive void reactivity vulnerability of RBMK reactors. No one actually knew about these this phenomenon. The one ministry built them and commissioned them, but did not operate them. Another ministry operated them, but lacked the expertise of the ministry that built them. People were expected to work around non-standard, partly defective equipment with non-automated safety systems. Shoddy workmanship plagued the Soviet Union, as we could understand during the Cold War. Fuel rod assemblies was stuck in channels was a common occurrence. So there was plenty of incidents, let's say smaller tier 2 or tier 3 type incidents, but no one was actually reacting to them. Nikolai Fomin was an electrical engineer who studied nuclear physics by correspondence after being made chief engineer at Chernobyl and deputy to the plant director, because he was a member of the Central Committee. So I've covered obviously what happened. We discussed to a fair degree of how this reactor ended up being in this condition. Now purpose of the exercise or this assignment is to get you to look at the information that I've presented, look at any of the other information that I've included as links to the in the actual PowerPoint, and against the part of the assignment is obviously to look at describing your understanding of the events, because that will help you then start answering the why questions. Root causes leading to the incident and the consequences, discuss them in terms of the compromised or absent preventative, which I think I've gone through. You can illustrate them using the bow tie if you like. Talk about the physical cause, the human causes, the unsafe acts. The latent causes, using the PSM elements, referring to the traverse elements, which are in the subsequent slides. Start to talk about the issues relating to design, training, leadership, workforce involvement, organisational, government versus safety objectives, government objectives versus safety objectives, risk identification, risk management, operational readiness to do a test when half the people that were supposed to be there left, and then delays in that test. Emergency preparedness, looking at what happened, how do they control the emergency after the explosion. Management of safety critical devices. These are latent causes that, working through the Ian Travis PSM elements, will help you answer those why questions.